The day I left, I was wearing my dead grandmother's boots and carrying a bag that smelled like cedar and old regret. Nobody saw me go. That was the whole point. And what happened 7 years later? I still don't know if it was justice or just the universe's ugliest form of irony. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where things always start in my family, with Grandma Olitha. Olitha Vasquez married at 16. Not because she was reckless or in love or even particularly willing, but because her mother told her that a woman's sharpest talent is knowing which doors to walk through before they're slammed shut. She stayed home. She raised 4 children in a house that smelled perpetually of rendered lard and rosemary. She never once drove a car. When she died at 73, the eulogy was given by a pastor who'd never met her, and he talked for 11 minutes about her pie crust. My mother, Conceição, everyone called her Sina, though I always thought the full name was more honest about who she was, something heavy and complete and a little hard to pronounce, did exactly what Olitha had done. She married Papai Ronaldo at 19. She was pregnant with me by 20. She homeschooled my brothers and me until the county made her stop. She cooked, cleaned, preserved fruit in August, and spent every December making a calendar of saints' days that she'd distribute to people at church who I'm fairly sure just threw them away. She was not a stupid woman. That's what nobody understands when I try to explain her. Sina was razor sharp, operationally brilliant, capable of managing a household budget on what would make most financial analysts weep, and deeply, profoundly committed to a world she had constructed out of her mother's instructions and her own fear. Intelligence in service of a closed system is still intelligent. It just looks like something else from the outside. I was Sina's eldest daughter. In our family, that was less a birth order and more a sentence. The tradition, as she called it, with a reverence she reserved otherwise only for the Virgin Mary and Olitha's recipes, was simple. The eldest daughter stays. She is the continuity. She is the proof that the women of this line know their purpose. She learns the house, she learns the rhythms, she finds a husband from the church directory or from the cousin of someone's neighbor, and she does not wander. My younger sister Beatrice seemed perfectly content with this arrangement. She was soft-spoken and kind and genuinely enjoyed making bread. My brothers Clovis and Edmundo were permitted to have ambitions. They were, after all, men, and they acted accordingly, with a casual entitlement that I spent years pretending not to notice. I was the problem. Not because I was difficult exactly. I did my chores. I helped with Beatrice when she was small and clingy. I attended Mass without complaint and helped fold the newsletter. But I read. I read everything. I read the encyclopedia volumes that Papai kept in the back room like trophies he'd never use. I read his old trade manuals from when he worked in electrical systems. I read paperbacks that I found in the donation bin outside the thrift store on Rua Marginal. I read things I didn't understand and then read them again until I did. By 14, I was doing calculus from a textbook I'd borrowed from the county library under a false pretense. By 16, I was corresponding, by actual physical letter, because the internet was rationed in our house, with a mathematics teacher named Senor Afranio Queluz in a city 3 hours away, who had placed a classified ad in a regional academic bulletin seeking students for an unofficial correspondence course. He never asked why I wrote by hand or why my address was a post office box belonging to my friend Morella's aunt. He just kept sending problems. The MIT application was Queluz's idea. I told him it was impossible. He told me that impossibility was a story people told to make peace with their laziness, and that I was not lazy, only afraid. Then he sent me the application materials, along with a letter of recommendation he had already written, and a note that said, "Fill it out, send it. Whatever happens is information." I filled it out at Morella's aunt's kitchen table, over 3 weekends while pretending to attend a series of fabricated sewing workshops. I wrote about mathematics as a form of cartography, mapping the undiscovered country of pattern and proof. I wrote about Olitha, though I didn't name her. I wrote about the feeling of holding two things that shouldn't fit together and finding the proof that they do. When the acceptance letter came to Morella's aunt's address, the woman called me at the one payphone in our neighborhood that still worked and said, Simply, vem buscar isso aqui. Come pick this up. I held the envelope for a long time before I opened it. Then I made the mistake that changed everything. I brought the letter home. I don't know what I expected. Some part of me, the foolish, hopeful 16-year-old part that had been reading correspondence problems and dreaming in theorems, thought that perhaps Sinha would see it and something in her would shift, that a letter from MIT would be too large an achievement to fit inside her framework, that it would break the glass and let in air. What actually happened was that she read it in silence, set it on the kitchen table, looked at me for a long moment with an expression I can only describe as pre-grief, the face of someone who has already started mourning something that is still technically alive, and then, with both hands, tore it cleanly in half. "This is not who we are," she said. She said it quietly, without heat. That was the worst part. Anger I could have used. Anger is energy, and energy can be redirected. What she gave me was certainty. Absolute, refrigerated, load-bearing certainty. She was not forbidding me. She was informing me of a fact. I picked up both halves. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed for a while, looking at the two pieces of paper, and I understood something that I had perhaps known for a long time, but refused to fully process. I could not change her mind. Not with this letter, not with 10 letters, not with a Nobel Prize delivered in a velvet box. Sinha's world was sealed from the inside. I found a roll of tape in the drawer where we kept small tools. I put the letter back together. I set it flat under a heavy book to press out the crease. Then I started packing. I didn't pack much. I couldn't afford to, logistically or emotionally. A change of clothes. The correspondence from Kalu's, bundled with a rubber band. Olitha's boots, which I had always been told would be mine eventually, so I figured I was just adjusting the timeline. Papai's old slide rule, which he never used, which I had always used, which felt like taking something that was already mine, even if neither of us had ever formally acknowledged it. The two halves of the letter now taped and folded into my breast pocket. I set my alarm for 4:15. I slept somehow in the way you sleep before something enormous, which is not restful but is very complete. At 5:01 a.m., I walked out the front door. I did not write a note. I had drafted 4 different versions during the night, and they all sounded either like an accusation or an apology, and I was neither accusing nor apologizing. I was simply leaving. The door made its small, familiar click. The street outside was the color of a bruise, that deep blue-gray before dawn resolves itself into something committed. I walked 4 blocks to the bus stop. I had enough money for a ticket to the regional hub, and from there a series of buses that would eventually get me to a shelter in the city Kalu's had recommended, run by a women's education nonprofit with whom he had, it turned out, a long and productive relationship. On the second bus, I finally cried, though not for long. Then I looked out the window at the flatlands going pale in the early light and thought about differential equations, which is what I always did when I needed to feel like the world had an underlying structure that would hold. The shelter was called Casa Iris, House of the Rainbow, an almost aggressively optimistic name that turned out to be entirely accurate in spirit. The woman who ran it was named Dr. Perpetua Holst, half Norwegian, half Recifense, with a voice like a foghorn and a complete lack of patience for self-pity that I found unexpectedly incredibly useful. She had a rule: no wallowing past 9 p.m. After 9 p.m., you were allowed to feel things, but between 7 a.m. and 9 p.m., you worked, you planned, and you moved. She also had a contact at MIT's financial aid office, which suggested that my arrival was not entirely unanticipated on Kalu's end. I spent the next several weeks in a process that felt like being disassembled and rebuilt. Visa applications, deferred enrollment paperwork, scholarship confirmations, a health screening, an English proficiency test that I passed with a score that made the administrator look at me twice. I spoke to no one from my family during this time, not because I was punishing them, but because I had no language for what I was doing that wouldn't immediately become a negotiation, and I had nothing to negotiate with. I had already made my decision. The decision was not reversible. Talking would only introduce confusion where there was now, for the first time in my life, something close to clarity. The flight to Boston was the first flight I had ever taken. I held the armrest through takeoff, and then, when we broke through the cloud layer and I saw the sun blazing off the tops of the cumulus below me, I let go. MIT was, I'm going to be honest with you, not immediately delightful. It was enormous and demanding and full of people who were brilliant in ways that were entirely different from my kind of brilliance. And I spent the first 6 weeks feeling like a fraud in a building where the walls themselves seemed to know more than I did. My roommate was a girl named Sigríður from Reykjavik, who communicated primarily through handwritten sticky notes, and turned out to be, once we'd established our respective spatial preferences, one of the best people I have ever known. I studied. I studied in the specific, monk-like, slightly feverish way that people study when they know that the studying is not just education, but survival. I ate badly. I slept in cycles rather than hours. I went to office hours so often that 2 of my professors eventually asked if I was experiencing housing instability. But I also, and this is the part nobody tells you about the life-breaking choice, the walking out before dawn story, I also fell in love with it, with the work, with the cold and particular beauty of a proof assembling itself under your hands, with the strange community of people who were, like me, fundamentally more comfortable with equations than with most humans. With the Charles River in winter, ugly and gorgeous, with ice at the edges and geese standing on it as if they hadn't gotten the memo about improbability. I graduated 4 years later with a degree in mathematics and a secondary in computational linguistics. Kayluz, who had flown up for the ceremony, wept openly and then pretended he had allergies. Sigríður took approximately 400 photographs. I did not invite my family. That felt important to say plainly without dramatizing it. I went on to a graduate program. I deferred once, took a year working for a modeling firm in Cambridge that was doing interesting things with acoustic signal prediction, and then went back and finished my doctorate. My dissertation was on topological data analysis applied to speech pattern recognition, which sounds more exotic than it is, though it is admittedly somewhat exotic. In the 7 years since I'd left, I had sent my family precisely 3 communications. A postcard when I arrived in Boston that said only, "I am safe." A letter when I graduated that included a photograph and no return address, and a note when Papai had a cardiac episode. I found out through the distant relay of Morella, who had maintained a careful, low-drama connection to my family on my behalf, that said, "I heard about Ronaldo. I am glad he is recovering. I think about you." I never received a response to any of these. I told myself this was information, not verdict. Then came the call. It was a Tuesday in October, 7 years and 4 months after I'd left, and I was sitting in my office at the Research Institute where I'd taken a postdoctoral position, eating a bowl of soup from the vending machine that was technically tomato-flavored, and working through a knotted section of a paper I was co-authoring on pattern divergence in regional dialect mapping. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but a country code I did. I stared at it for a long time, longer than was reasonable. Then I picked it up. It was Beatrice. Her voice was the same, still soft, still careful, but there was something underneath it that I recognized as the sound of someone choosing each word while standing at the edge of something. She said she'd gotten my number from Morella. She said she hoped it was okay that she was calling. She said, and here is where the story does what stories do when they have been building pressure for 7 years. She said, "Mai has been reading." A silence. I waited. "She found your dissertation online. She printed it out. All 83 pages. She keeps it on the kitchen table. Beatrice stopped. I heard her exhale. "She doesn't tell anyone what it is. She has it there." She made Clovis read the abstract. He didn't understand it. She seemed frustrated that he didn't understand it. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside my window, the Cambridge October was doing its famous performance. All gold and red and the particular blue of a sky that knows winter is coming and is not apologetic about it. "Is she well?" I finally asked. "She's the same," Beatrice said. "You know how she is." I did know how she was. That was the complicated part. She asks about you, Beatrice said. Not directly, she asks Morella's aunt if she's heard anything. She asks like she's asking about the weather somewhere far away. Like it's information she wants but doesn't want to be seen wanting. I thought about a woman sitting at a kitchen table in a house that smelled of rendered lard and rosemary, her calloused hands smoothing the edges of a printed academic document she didn't fully understand, guarding it against a question she had never learned to ask. I thought about a letter torn in half and then taped back together. I thought about a door I had walked out of at 5 in the morning, wearing dead woman's boots, carrying only the things that were already mine. Here is what I have come to understand. In 7 years of learning things the hard way and the long way, and the only way that actually works. The women in my family were not wrong that tradition is a form of survival. They were wrong only about which tradition to choose. Olitha survived by learning the geometry of small rooms. I survived by learning the geometry of everything else. Both of us were, in our own way, doing the same fundamental thing, finding the structure that holds. The difference is that my structure has an open topology. It keeps adding rooms. I called Beatrice back the next evening. We talked for 2 hours. I learned that she had, quietly and with characteristic soft-spokenness, begun taking online courses in agricultural systems management, which she applied to the garden she maintained behind the house, and which had, over 3 years, turned into something that was essentially a small productive farm. Nobody had framed this as education. She had simply done it and kept doing it until it was fact. She told me that Sinha had watched her do this without comment. I thought about Sinha's way of watching things without comment and realized that perhaps, for a woman of her particular construction, silence was not rejection. Silence was the closest thing she had to a door left open. I went back in January. The 3rd week of January, which is the ugliest week of the year in most places, and particularly in the flat interior where I grew up, where the sky is white like old porcelain and the dust gets into everything. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with no announcement. I had told Beatrice only that I was coming, not the specific day. Sinha was in the kitchen. She was making the kind of bread she made every week, the same she'd made every week of my childhood, dense and fragrant with anise, shaped in a long oval and scored across the top with 3 diagonal cuts. Her hands moved through the familiar architecture of it with the efficiency of something that has been done so many times it no longer requires thought. She didn't hear me come in. I stood in the doorway for a moment. On the kitchen table, beside the bread pan and the flour sack, there was a stack of printed pages bound with a binder clip. 83 pages, I would have bet. The top page was the abstract, which used words like topological persistence and phonemic trajectory mapping, and which my mother, by any objective measure, should not have found meaningful. She had written in the margins, in her small, careful, deeply idiosyncratic cursive, the handwriting of a woman who had educated herself in the spaces that her own education had not reached. She had written questions, not corrections, not dismissals. Questions. What is persistence here? She had written next to one passage, and next to another. This is like how a word changes when it travels between towns. She was asking the right questions. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that the light in the kitchen changed slightly, the way it does in late afternoon when the sun moves past a certain angle and everything goes briefly, tenderly amber. Then she turned around. We looked at each other. 7 years is a very long time when you measure it in the ways time usually gets measured, in dinners and holidays and small daily accumulations. It is almost no time at all when you measure it in the things that don't change. The particular way she held her shoulders, slightly raised, like she was perpetually braced. The color of her eyes, which were dark and still and gave nothing away for free. She looked at me. She looked at the table. She looked back at me. Your crust technique is off, I said, finally, because I had to say something, and that was what came out. Something I had absorbed through pure osmosis in a childhood spent watching her hands. She looked at the bread. She looked at me again. I know, she said. The humidity has been wrong this week. And that, improbably, was where we started. Not with apology, not with explanation, not with the 7 years of compressed silence between us, unfolding all at once like a time-lapse flower. We started with bread and humidity and the problem of crust, which is, if you think about it, also a problem of structure, of what holds and what yields and what the right conditions are for something to become what it was always meant to be. I stayed for 4 days. We did not have any of the conversations you might expect. We had instead many small parallel conversations about adjacent things, which is, I have come to understand, the only way some truths travel between people who have been built the way we were built. On the last morning, before the car came to take me to the regional bus hub, she handed me a bag with bread in it. The same bread. The anise and crust bread of my entire childhood. Your grandmother's recipe, she said. I never gave it to you. It was not an apology. It was not a blessing. It was a woman handing me something she had been holding for 7 years and choosing, now, to let it go. I took it. The boots. Oletha's boots. The ones I'd walked away in. I left at the door of the house when I left. I didn't make a thing of it. I just left them there. I don't know if she understood why. I suspect she did. The study of pattern tells you this. Nothing is random. What looks like chaos, when you have the right tools and enough patience to look closely, reveals its topology. The shape of the space, where the holes are, what connects to what. My family has a tradition. I changed it. It is still changing. Beatriz is studying. The boots are by the door. 83 pages sit on a kitchen table with questions written in the margins in my mother's small, careful hand. That's not an ending. That's a topology, a space that is still blessedly open. If this story moved something in you, leave a like and subscribe. The next one goes even deeper.